What starts as a simple courtroom hearing, just another day, just another case, quickly turns into something no one expects when a quiet 13-year-old boy stands up and delivers a legal argument that shakes the entire system. They thought he was just a kid, just a face in the crowd, but they didn't know he'd spent weeks studying, preparing, and carrying the weight of injustice on his shoulders. What follows is a powerful story of truth, courage, and the moment a boy with a binder becomes the voice everyone in that courtroom had to hear. Trust me, by the end of this story you won't look at silence the same way again. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story moves you, be sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that speak truth to power. The courtroom wasn't silent, it was holding its breath. The benches were packed shoulder to shoulder, every seat taken the air thick with whispers and shuffling papers, and the faint squeak of old wood beneath restless feet. People leaned forward in their chairs, craning their necks toward the front, where nothing was happening just yet, but where everyone expected something big to unfold. And yet, in that sea of expectation, no one saw the boy. Not at first. Not until he moved. He was small for 13, barely filling the space on the third bench near the aisle, his backpack still slung over one shoulder like he hadn't quite realized he wasn't at school anymore. He wore a faded plaid shirt tucked into brown corduroy pants that rode up just a little above his ankles, revealing white socks and sneakers that looked like they'd seen more sidewalks than classrooms. His feet didn't touch the floor. They hung gently, swinging heel to toe, like they were measuring time. No one noticed him because he was quiet, too quiet for a room filled with adults who thought they knew how courtrooms were supposed to sound. His name was Jamari Davis, and he didn't stand up to make a point. He stood up because something inside him wouldn't let him stay seated anymore. His grandmother Dolores, seated beside him in a floral dress and a long black cardigan, barely had time to glance his way before whispering, "Jamari, baby, sit down." Her voice cracked like a dry twig underfoot, fragile and desperate, a sound he'd never heard from her before. But he didn't sit down. He didn't even pause. He just stood there for a moment, both hands clutching the old blue binder he'd been carrying for weeks, the corners frayed, one label peeling up to reveal his name printed in careful block letters underneath. He stepped out into the aisle like it belonged to him, like he wasn't afraid of the 100 eyes that turned to watch him move. The room reacted slowly, murmurs falling off mid-sentence, a cough cut short the shuffle of jackets and purses, stopping one by one. His sneakers made soft rhythmic sounds on the wooden floor. Scrape step, a steady beat in a room that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. The judge hadn't entered yet, the lawyers were still arranging papers, the court reporter was adjusting her machine, but the boy kept walking forward, uninvited, unannounced, unstoppable. He didn't look left or right. He didn't scan the gallery or search for familiar faces. His eyes were fixed on the front, on the defense table, where his uncle, Ernest E.J. Hayes, sat shackled and staring at the floor like he'd already been sentenced in spirit if not in law. E.J. didn't see Jamari approach at first, but Dolores did. She stood halfway, reaching forward, with one trembling hand, as if she could pull the boy back by sheer force of will. "Please," she whispered under her breath, not to him exactly but to whatever moment was overtaking them. Jamari didn't stop. He reached the defense table, placed his binder down slowly like it was something sacred, then turned to face the judge's bench, still empty. And just like that, the courtroom settled again, not into calm but into stillness. The kind of stillness that feels like the second before a summer storm hits. You can't see it yet, but every leaf, every bird, every human instinct knows it's coming. And that's what it felt like. Something was about to happen, and it was going to start with a boy no one had even noticed 5 minutes ago. A woman seated near the back whispered, "Is that the nephew?" Another man said, "Why is he up there?" But no one moved. No one stopped him. Not the bailiff, not the prosecutor, not even the public defender fumbling through her folder like she'd lost the only copy of the truth. There was something in the way Jamari stood back, straight shoulders, tight mouth pressed shut, that told everyone he wasn't performing. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to say something that had been building for too long to keep inside any longer. He took one breath deep and slow, like he was tasting the moment, and then another shorter this time, like he was readying his voice. He placed one hand on the binder, the other still at his side, and waited. Not for permission, not for applause. just for the silence to settle enough for his voice to matter. And in that stillness beneath fluorescent lights, the clatter of legal pads, and the tension of too many eyes, Jamari Davis became something no one had prepared for: the center of gravity in a room built to make children disappear. He didn't blink. He didn't fidget. He just stood 13 years old, the quiet kid nobody ever expected to speak, finally refusing to stay silent. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't belong to the judge or the attorneys or the bailiffs at the door. It belonged to the boy with the blue binder. On the corner of East 37th and Olive Street, under the dull hum of a flickering street lamp, Ernest E.J. Hayes walked the same path he had taken every evening for the past 17 years. His postal uniform clung to his back, with sweat, his cap slightly tilted, and a half-opened package tucked under his arm. A small brown box, meant for a house, 3 doors down, but accidentally delivered to his own route. The sky was soft with dusk, that quiet blue-orange blend that made the air feel thicker, as if the day was reluctant to let go. Cars rolled slowly past windows, up radios. Murmuring street dogs barked from somewhere behind wooden fences, but E.J. wasn't paying attention to any of it. He was thinking about dinner, maybe frying some catfish, maybe just leftovers, and whether or not his mama was serious about needing more aspirin. He didn't see the cruiser pull up behind him right away, not until the red and blue lights washed over the sidewalk, casting his shadow long across the chain-link fence. He turned slow and cautious, not startled exactly, but with that sinking sensation that came from years of knowing what came next. The officer on the passenger side stepped out first, tall and thick-necked, hand already near his belt, eyes narrow. The driver followed, younger, white, maybe mid-30s, face unreadable but tone sharp. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" the taller one asked, voice carrying more suspicion than curiosity. E.J. adjusted the strap of his bag and nodded politely. "Just returning a misdelivered package. Belongs to that porch right there." He pointed steady to the house with the blue mailbox, and the porch swing still swaying in the summer breeze. The younger cop glanced toward it, then back at him, stepping closer. "Do you live around here, E.J.?" Nodded again, jaw tight now. "Yes, I'm on my route. I'm a carrier. See the badge." He motioned to the small USPS logo on his shirt, the one that had frayed edges but still meant something to him. There was a beat of silence, just enough for discomfort to settle in. The tall one frowned. "Got ID?" E.J. reached slowly for his wallet, keeping his other hand visible, every movement deliberate. He handed it over, and as they scanned it, a tension grew. Not loud, not violent, just that subtle, crawling kind of pressure that made your ribs tighten and your mouth go dry. "You mind if we search the package?" the white officer asked, tilting his head. "It's sealed," E.J. said, voice even. "And it's not mine. It's federal property." The taller cop's lips curled slightly. "You refusing a lawful request." That's when E.J. felt something in the air shift, like the moment right before glass breaks. He stepped back instinctively, one hand raised, palm out in protest. "I'm just doing my job, man," he said, low measured. "Ain't nothing suspicious here." But by then, it was too late. The taller officer stepped in fast, grabbing E.J.'s arm and twisting it behind his back, pushing him forward toward the hood of the cruiser while shouting, "Stop resisting!" even though E.J. wasn't resisting at all. The sound of his body hitting the metal hood rang through the neighborhood like a dropped cymbal. A porch light came on across the street. Somewhere, a curtain moved, but no one came out. The younger cop stood back, eyes darting, hands still hovering near his sidearm but not moving. "Man, what are you doing?" E.J. gasped, his voice strained with pain as his shoulder twisted deeper. "I told you what I was doing." The officer didn't answer. He pushed harder. The package hit the ground and rolled onto the curb. "You matched a description," the taller one said curtly, as if that explained everything. By the time the cuffs were on, E.J.'s face was scraped, his breath heavy, his pulse racing like it was trying to outrun the moment. They shoved him into the back seat without another word, the door slamming with the kind of finality that made it clear whatever rights he thought he had, they didn't apply here, not now, not to him. When the call came in at 9:27 p.m., Dolores was sitting on the edge of her bed with a crossword puzzle in her lap and her glasses slipping down her nose. The voice on the other end was flat, procedural. "Ma'am, we have your son in custody at Chatham County Jail." She didn't say anything for several seconds. Just stared at the wall in front of her like it had turned into a tunnel. "Is he okay?" she finally asked, her voice smaller than it had been in years. "You'll need to speak with the officers on duty," the voice replied before disconnecting. She sat very still for a long time, then stood and walked into the hallway where Jamari was sitting on the floor, sorting coins from a jar. He looked up confused. "What's wrong, Nana?" She didn't answer right away. She just sat beside him, slowly, knees cracking, and whispered, "They took your uncle." Jamari blinked. "What do you mean, took him?" She shook her head as if trying to dislodge a thought she couldn't make sense of. "The police," she said finally. "They arrested him. They said he resisted." The words hung between them like smoke curling into the corners of the room. Jamari didn't know what to say. He just watched her hands tremble as she reached for the phone, again dialing numbers that went to voicemail, leaving messages that felt like echoes. "Please call back. Please just tell me he's all right." That night the house felt different. Not just quieter, but heavier, like something had broken loose from the foundation and settled into the walls. The lights were dimmer. The ticking clock in the kitchen felt too loud, the shadows too long. Jamari sat on his bed later, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how a normal walk could turn into handcuffs, how someone like EJ, the kindest man he knew, could end up behind bars. He didn't fall asleep. He just waited for morning, eyes open, heart pacing a new kind of question, growing quietly in the dark. They said the footage would tell the truth, but the truth depends on where the camera starts and when it begins to roll. The body cam video began halfway through the encounter, right when EJ was already being pinned against the hood, one arm twisted unnaturally behind his back, face clenched in pain, his voice caught between a plea and a protest. The audio crackled with commands shouted too late. Stop resisting, stop moving, even though EJ's legs had already buckled beneath him. The footage was jumpy, the angle poor, the officers partially out of frame, but it didn't matter to the report because the beginning wasn't there to contradict the end. The part where EJ calmly explained himself, where he showed his ID, where he pointed to the correct address, none of that was captured. Just grunts, friction, and a still frame of a man on the ground with handcuffs biting into his wrists. They called it assault on a peace officer, cited a scratch on one forearm and a bruised shin as proof that force had been necessary. They wrote it clean in the paperwork paragraphs, neatly typed timestamps included, even though the timeline didn't match up with the neighbor's recording from across the street. That footage was blurrier, taken from behind a dusty window with a shaky hand, but you could see EJ standing still, his hands raised, his voice calm. Then suddenly his body jerked forward as if yanked by a string, and he disappeared beneath the frame as the cruiser lights flashed red and blue against the nearby parked cars. There was no audio in that clip. Just movement, just violence, just the soundless evidence that something had gone very wrong. Jamari watched both videos on his grandmother's old laptop, the screen scratched and the volume low, but his mind filled in what the cameras didn't catch. He replayed them again and again, until every second was burned into his memory, until he could anticipate each shift in angle, each shout, each time someone looked away. "This doesn't show what really happened," he said quietly, one night, eyes glued to the screen. Dolores sat beside him on the couch, arms folded tight, her lips pressed thin. "They never show the whole story," she replied, her voice flat and dry like brittle paper. The neighborhood didn't stay silent either. At the barbershop on Martin Street, the old men clucked their tongues and shook their heads, some blaming EJ, and for talking back, others blaming the badge for not seeing the man behind the uniform. "He should have just gone along with it," one man said, flipping through the sports section. "That's how you survive." But another shook his head. "Since when does walking while black come with an instruction manual?" No one laughed. Outside church the next Sunday, Jamari heard the whispers again, low but clear. "It's a shame. He was such a nice man. Always said good morning. Guess you never really know what folks do when nobody's watching." Jamari turned away from them, fists clenched in his pockets, walking faster to the car, as if distance could silence ignorance. It didn't. The talk followed him to school, through the hallways, at his locker, even on the basketball court, where teammates suddenly avoided eye contact, where teachers spoke to him slower, softer, as if careful not to say the wrong thing, but too afraid to say anything right. But none of that hurt as much as the silence from inside the jail. EJ was only allowed one call, and by the time Dolores got it, she could barely understand his voice through the static and exhaustion. "They say I resisted," he murmured, "but all I did was ask why." She nodded on the other end, even though he couldn't see her. "I know, son," she whispered. "I know." Later that week, she was granted a 5-minute visit. She didn't take Jamari with her, said it was no place for a child. But when she came back, she looked older. Somehow, shoulders lower, steps slower, eyes heavier. Jamari didn't ask how it went. He just waited for her to speak. That night, she stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of beans with a wooden spoon. The rhythm slow and distracted. "His shoulders messed up," she said without looking up. "They said he fell." He didn't fall. Jamari sat at the table with a pencil in hand, and no paper, just tracing invisible lines against the wood grain. He didn't speak either. He just thought about how many times EJ had told him, always stay calm, always be respectful, never give them a reason. And still, somehow, even without a reason, this had happened. The next morning, Jamari sat on the porch for nearly an hour, the blue binder resting on his knees unopened. He watched cars pass, birds flutter between wires, a dog bark across the street, and all of it felt too normal, too undisturbed by the truth that was tearing through their lives. He pressed the binder to his chest and closed his eyes, the weight of it grounding him, like it was the only thing keeping him from floating into the sky, screaming. And in that moment he didn't feel like a child anymore. He felt like a witness. No one had asked for holding on to a version of the story. No one seemed willing to hear. The house felt heavier after the arrest, like every wall had absorbed a piece of the silence and refused to let it go. The clock still ticked, the refrigerator still hummed, and the front porch still creaked when someone stepped on the third plank, but nothing sounded the same. Even the air had changed. It moved slower, sat thicker in the corners, as if grief itself had found a seat and wasn't planning to leave. Dolores still made the coffee every morning, still folded the laundry on the couch with practiced hands, but her movements had a drag to them now, as if her limbs were marching through wet cement, each gesture more habit than hope. Jamari noticed everything, the way she stirred her spoon too long in an empty cup, the way she stood at the sink without running the water, the way she kept opening the same drawer and forgetting what she was looking for. He didn't ask questions. He didn't know which ones would help and which would make her cry, and he wasn't sure he could handle either. Instead, he watched. He kept to himself. He did his homework without being told, took out the trash before she noticed, and spent more time in his room than anywhere else. Not because he wanted to be alone, but because the house didn't feel like it had space for both of their sorrow at once. At night, Jamari lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to picture EJ. In that cold, fluorescent-lit jail cell, surrounded by people who didn't know the man who made the best grilled cheese on the block or fixed bikes for the neighborhood kids every Saturday afternoon. He kept thinking about EJ's hands, how gentle they were when he patched a scraped knee, how steady they felt when resting on Jamari's shoulder during school recitals. The same hands were now bruised, cuffed, labeled as a threat. That contradiction haunted him. Sometimes Dolores would sit in the living room with the television on, but the volume turned down so low it was more memory than sound. Jamari would glance at the flickering screen and see old westerns or reruns of game shows, nothing she actually liked, just noise she'd mumble if he asked. The silence is too loud. One evening as she sat in her favorite chair, her hands folded in her lap and her feet barely reaching the rug, Jamari approached her, slowly, unsure of what he wanted to say, only knowing that the words had been sitting in his chest too long. "Nana," he began, and his voice cracked halfway through the word. She looked up, eyes tired but kind, and waited. "Do you think they're gonna let him go?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him for a long time, studying his face like it might hold a piece of the truth she'd misplaced. Then finally she exhaled, slow and quiet, and said, "I think they've already decided who they think he is. The question is whether we can make them see who he really is." Jamari nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. He understood the feeling behind it, the heaviness, the frustration, the quiet war between reality and reputation, but the path forward still felt like a fogged-up mirror. That night he opened his blue binder for the first time in days. It still held old math worksheets and permission slips at the back, but the front was now filled with notes, scribbled thoughts, dates, and questions. At first, he hadn't realized he was building something. He was just writing to think, to understand, to not feel so helpless. He wrote down what the officers had said, how their words didn't line up with the video, how EJ had complied, how there had been no weapon, no threat, just a moment that was twisted into something unrecognizable. He wrote in big letters across one page, "What do they see when they look at us?" Then, underneath that, smaller, more fragile, "How do we make them see more?" He didn't show Dolores what he was writing, not because he didn't trust her, but because it felt like something he needed to do alone. Writing was quiet, work slow and private, like tending to a garden no one else believed could grow. And yet every day after school he sat in the same chair at the kitchen table, flipping pages, underlining key phrases, rereading the Constitution he'd printed out from the library. He didn't understand every word, but he understood the feeling that justice wasn't supposed to depend on what color your skin was, or how polite you sounded when you asked why. One afternoon as he sat there, the light from the window casting soft shadows across his notebook, Dolores walked in and paused in the doorway. She didn't speak at first. She just watched him, the way his lips moved silently, while reading, the way he tapped the pen against his cheek when he was stuck, the way he tilted his head when something didn't sit right. Finally she asked, "You still doing schoolwork, baby?" He shook his head gently. "No, Nana. I'm just trying to understand it all." She nodded, slow and thoughtful, and walked over to rest her hand on his shoulder. It was warm, familiar, steady. "You trying to fix the world in that binder?" she asked, and there was a faint smile in her voice, not teasing, just tender. Jamari looked up at her, his eyes serious. "No," he said, "just trying to make it tell the truth." She didn't say anything after that. She just stood beside him for a minute, then turned and walked back to the living room, the sound of her slippers soft against the linoleum. Jamari watched her go, then looked back down at the page in front of him where he had written 3 simple words in all caps: "Tell the story." He underlined it twice, then pressed the tip of his pen against the paper and held it there, letting the ink sink into the grain. And for the first time since the arrest, the heaviness in his chest didn't feel quite so paralyzing. It was still there, still real, but it had a shape now, and more importantly, it had a name. It started not as a plan but as a quiet ripple, a passing thought in Jamari's head that refused to settle, growing louder each night as the house slipped into silence and the streetlights blinked like tired eyes. He would sit at the kitchen table after school, elbows on the wood worn smooth by years of homework and spilled juice and evening prayers, and flip through the pages of his blue binder like it held a code only he could decipher. At first, the writing was scattered, random thoughts, broken sentences, fragments of conversations he remembered hearing through the wall, things EJ had said that didn't make it into any police report. But slowly, without even realizing it, Jamari began turning the chaos into order. He started organizing the timeline when the lights flashed behind EJ, when the officers approached, what was said, what wasn't. He marked details in the margins, used stars and arrows and underlines to show patterns, contradictions, gaps. He borrowed a legal dictionary from the school library and copied down definitions in small, precise letters. Probable cause, unlawful detention, excessive force. He didn't understand all of it right away, but the words felt powerful, like armor. They were the opposite of guesswork. They were structure, and structure was something he could hold on to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. At dinner, he asked questions without making them sound like questions. "Do you think it matters what time the stop happened?" Dolores would glance at him over her glasses, cautious but curious. "Depends who's asking," she'd reply. Other nights, he stayed quiet, chewing slower than usual, his mind moving faster than his mouth ever could. One evening, after Dolores had gone to bed early with a headache she didn't want to talk about, Jamari stayed up flipping through pages under the soft yellow light above the stove. He found a case mentioned in the back of the dictionary, Terry versus Ohio, and wrote the title in capital letters across a new page. He didn't know what made him care about that particular one, only that it involved a stop and a search, and something called reasonable suspicion, which sounded an awful lot like the kind of reasoning used on EJ. That night, Jamari opened his laptop, fingers trembling slightly, and searched the case online. He read every summary he could find, watched video breakdowns from legal channels, paused every 5 seconds to write something down. His handwriting got messier the later it got, but his understanding deepened. He learned about stop and frisk, about the balance between public safety and personal rights, about how fear sometimes masqueraded as justification. Around midnight, he whispered aloud a sentence he'd just read. "The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures." His voice barely reached the ceiling, but it echoed in his chest. He repeated it twice, then a third time, slower. It sounded like a spell, something ancient and sacred, like a promise that had been broken too many times. Jamari didn't sleep much that night. He stayed at the table until the window fogged with morning dew, until the binder was thick with notes, and his pencil had dulled to a stub. Over the next few days, he stopped playing ball at the park, stopped riding his bike to the corner store for chips and soda, stopped answering group texts from classmates who were already moving on to whatever came after shock. Instead, he built a new kind of routine. After school, he went straight to the public library, greeted the older man behind the front desk with a polite "good afternoon," and headed straight to the back corner where the law books were kept. He read in silence, pen in hand, sometimes mumbling parts of the Constitution under his breath, sometimes highlighting passages in borrowed civics textbooks with neon pink sticky notes. One day, Miss Jenkins, the librarian, paused on her way past him and said gently, "Most kids your age are reading graphic novels or sports magazines." Jamari looked up, blinked once, and answered quietly, "My uncle's not most people." She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded and walked away, leaving him in his bubble of focus, surrounded by dusty pages and fluorescent light. At home, he started practicing how to speak the words he was writing. He'd stand in the hallway or the backyard and talk to no one, repeating key phrases like he was rehearsing for a moment that didn't exist yet but might someday. He mimicked the rhythm of lawyers he'd seen on YouTube, pausing at the right places, emphasizing the right words, not because he wanted to sound smart, but because he knew clarity was the only defense he had. Dolores heard him one evening through the wall, his voice steady and low, like a preacher speaking to an empty church. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there with her hand on the doorframe, her lips pressed together in equal parts, awe and heartbreak. One evening, as Jamari flipped through his notes, Dolores finally asked, "What are you trying to do, baby?" He looked up, not startled, just focused. "I'm trying to figure out the rules," he said, voice even. "If I don't know them, how do I know if they broke them?" She looked at him for a long moment, then walked over and kissed the top of his head. "That's a heavy load for a boy," she whispered. He didn't look away. "I'm already carrying it," he said. That night, Jamari rewrote his timeline again, this time in bold, clean letters with color-coded tabs and a list of open questions he still didn't have answers to. But for once, he wasn't overwhelmed by the uncertainty. He didn't feel powerless or small. He felt like he was getting closer to something honest, something that couldn't be edited out, or twisted, or ignored. And as he closed the binder and ran his fingers across its worn cover, he realized the truth didn't just need to be spoken. It needed to be heard. Each day after school, Jamari came home and headed straight to the kitchen table, not to eat, not to talk, but to return to his quiet ritual, unzip his backpack, slide out the now overstuffed blue binder, and open it like a doorway to a world where truth still mattered. The worn wood beneath his arms had become familiar, almost sacred, as if it had absorbed his concentration and was lending it back to him in return. There was a rhythm to it all, the sound of the pen scratching across paper, the low hum of the refrigerator in the background, the occasional creak of the floorboards, as Dolores moved from one end of the house to the other, always pausing in the hallway before continuing on. He worked in silence, focused not on the pain of what had happened, but on the structure of how it could be challenged, as though logic itself might offer a way through the chaos. He copied down passages from borrowed books, legal rulings, historical cases, definitions of rights that were supposed to be guaranteed, but too often weren't. He made timelines, lists of inconsistencies, questions about procedure. But it wasn't just research. It was something deeper. It was an act of reclaiming power, in a space where power had been stripped away. Sometimes he would speak out loud, reading sentences he had practiced so many times they no longer felt borrowed. According to the Fourth Amendment, a search without probable cause is unconstitutional. He would pause, then repeat the line slower, adding emphasis where he thought it mattered most. The smell of marijuana is not proof. It's a guess. He didn't need an audience. He wasn't performing. He was building something line by line, breath by breath. One night, Dolores stood quietly in the doorway, arms crossed her house shoes, scuffing against the tile just enough for him to notice. "What are you doing, baby?" she asked softly, not with disapproval, but with a weariness that had no name. Jamari looked up, startled, as if pulled from a trance, the pen still hovering over his notebook. "Just trying to figure it out," he said, voice low. "Figure what out?" she pressed, stepping closer. He hesitated, eyes dropping to the open pages filled with loops and arrows and highlighted quotes. "If I don't understand the rules, how do I know if they broke them?" For a moment she didn't speak. Then she walked over, placed a hand gently on his shoulder and squeezed. "This is not your fight, Jamari," she said, not harshly, but like someone trying to protect a piece of her heart that had already been bruised too many times. He looked up again, his eyes steady, and whispered, "It is now." She didn't argue. She just stood there a little longer, then turned and walked away, leaving the door open behind her. After that, something changed. She no longer asked what he was working on. She didn't stop him when he mumbled trial lines while pacing the hallway. She simply made sure the lamp on the table had a fresh bulb, that the printer had ink, that his tea stayed warm. In the quiet language of their home, it was permission. The binder grew heavier each week, bulging with photocopies, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings he'd cut out and taped down with care. He began creating his own summaries of legal precedents, distilling complex language into short, clear arguments he could remember, recite, defend. He studied recordings of courtroom speeches, watching how attorneys paused, how they commanded silence with a glance, how they anchored each argument in undeniable truth. He wasn't trying to be a lawyer. He was trying to understand how to speak in a place built to keep people like him quiet. One Sunday afternoon, he approached Mr. Carter, his civics teacher, just as the man was packing up after a community youth workshop. "Can I ask you something?" Jamari said, voice unsure but determined. Carter looked up surprised but curious. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Jamari hesitated, then asked, "Is there a way I could learn more about the law, about our rights?" The teacher studied him for a moment, then set down his bag and said, "Follow me." Inside a back room of the rec center, Carter pulled open a filing cabinet and handed Jamari a stack of printouts, landmark cases, summaries of constitutional protections, a guide to understanding probable cause. "Start with these," he said. "If you're serious, I'll help you." Jamari took the papers carefully like they were made of glass. "I am," he said. "I really am." Back at home, he read each document like scripture. Words like unreasonable search, detainment, consent became more than abstract concepts. They became tools. He began seeing patterns in the language of authority, in the way uncertainty was used as justification, in how fear was weaponized as fact. But the word that haunted him most, more than guilty or force or allegation, was reasonable. It was everywhere, in every ruling, in every justification. Reasonable force, reasonable suspicion, reasonable mistake. But who decided what was reasonable? A nervous cop, a tired judge, a system that had never been reasonable to people who looked like him. He wrote the question in capital letters across the inside cover of his binder. What's reasonable? Then just below it, a second question, smaller, more personal. And who gets to question them? Some nights he lay awake with those questions circling his head, not like fears, but like anchors. They didn't scare him. They grounded him. Because now he knew what he was doing had purpose, even if no one else understood it yet. One evening, as the sun began to set and the golden light pooled across the kitchen tiles, Jamari sat at the table again, binder open, pen in hand. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with weekend noise, laughter, car doors, slamming music, drifting through open windows, but inside the world was still. He took a breath, tapped his pen against the table, and began outlining a new section titled, simply, "If they don't listen, speak louder." And as he wrote, a quiet calm settled over him, not the absence of fear, but the presence of clarity, the kind that told him, without doubt, that even if he didn't have all the answers, he was finally asking the right questions. The courthouse doors opened slowly that morning, letting in a sharp breeze that carried the scent of wet pavement and damp pine, the kind of morning air that made everything feel exposed and a little too real. Jamari stepped inside, behind his grandmother, his sneakers sticking slightly to the freshly mopped tiles, his fingers clutching the blue binder tighter than he meant to. He had worn his best clothes, a white button-up shirt ironed the night before, slightly too big in the sleeves, and dark slacks that bunched awkwardly at his ankles, but nothing about him felt ready. The hall stretched long and narrow before them, the click of Dolores's shoes tapping a slow rhythm as they passed portraits of past judges staring down from gold-framed silence. They were early, half an hour before the hearing, but the courtroom was already half full, humming with soft murmurs and occasional coughs as if the air itself was waiting to settle. The pew-like benches groaned as people shifted their eyes, darting from faces they recognized to those they didn't. Some folks came out of concern, others out of curiosity, and a few, Jamari thought, just wanted to be present when anything happened. He and Dolores slid into a bench near the center, not too close to the front, not too far from the exit, and sat down in near-perfect unison. Jamari tried to steady his breathing, counting the seconds between inhale and exhale, but every noise made him jump a file folder, snapping shut the bailiff's boots, echoing against marble the creak of the judge's chair behind the bench. He glanced at the defense table where EJ sat, hands cuffed in front of him, shoulders slouched, an orange jumpsuit hanging loose across his chest. His face was tired, jaw tight, one eye swollen, but when his gaze met Jamari's, something softened. It wasn't a smile exactly, but more like recognition, a flicker of warmth that reminded Jamari of every lazy Saturday morning they had ever shared over eggs and cornbread and cartoons no one admitted they still liked. Dolores placed her hand on Jamari's knee, not to calm him but simply to anchor him. "You okay?" she asked in a whisper. He nodded, once swallowing hard. "Yeah," he said, barely audible, his voice trapped somewhere between fear and focus. The binder sat on his lap heavier than usual, as if it knew today would be different. The judge hadn't entered yet, and the public defender was still gathering her notes in a quiet corner, lips moving as if rehearsing lines in her head. Across the aisle, the prosecutor stood with a folder tucked against her ribs. Her charcoal suit perfectly pressed her eyes, scanning the room like someone taking inventory. Everything about her seemed measured and clean, like a well-sharpened pencil. Time moved strangely too fast in the moments he wanted to hold on to, and painfully slow in the seconds he wanted to escape. Jamari shifted in his seat and looked down at the notebook, his thumb tracing the edge of the page he had marked last night. He hadn't intended to speak today, not out loud, not in this room. But something inside him had shifted over the last few weeks, an understanding that silence was no longer an option, not when the truth had been buried beneath suspicion and protocol. Then came a pause, long enough for the tension to thicken, and in that pause, Jamari moved. He stood, slowly, deliberately. No one noticed at first, not even Dolores, who only realized what he was doing when she felt the absence of his weight beside her. "Jamari," she said under her breath, her voice tight, worried. But he didn't stop. He didn't even look back. He stepped into the aisle, the soft shuffle of his sneakers, suddenly the loudest sound in the room. The movement drew eyes. A few heads turned, then a few more, until the entire room seemed to pivot toward him like a tide pulled by something unseen. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, his hand resting lightly on his belt, eyes narrowing, but he didn't speak. There was something in the boy's posture that didn't seem like a threat, just intention. Jamari walked forward until he reached the defense table. EJ turned his headbrows raised in quiet surprise, but he didn't say a word. Jamari placed the binder gently on the wood in front of him, opened it to a marked page, and stood straight. He waited, heart-pounding legs, shaky throat dry. Then the door behind the bench opened with a soft thud. Judge Hart entered, his black robe trailing just above the floor, his face unreadable, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he took his seat. He looked out at the room, nodding once at the attorneys, then at the clerk before his gaze landed on the boy standing in front of the table. "What's this?" the judge asked, his voice neutral, more curious than annoyed. Jamari swallowed and stepped forward just a little. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I know I'm not supposed to be up here, but I wrote something. For my uncle. I was hoping I could read it. Just while we're waiting." There was a beat of silence long enough for uncertainty to take root. Then the judge glanced toward the prosecutor, who gave the smallest shrug. Judge Hart turned back to Jamari and nodded once. 2 minutes. Jamari opened the binder slowly, the sound of the page turning impossibly loud in the stillness. His fingers trembled at first, but when he began to speak, his voice was clear, clearer than he expected. "My name is Jamari Davis. I'm 13 years old, and I've been studying the law since the night my uncle was arrested." A few gasps rippled quietly through the gallery chairs. Shifted, a cough was stifled, but no one dared interrupt. Jamari kept going, eyes on the page, then up to the judge, then back again. "I've read the Fourth Amendment. I've read about unlawful searches. I've read what makes a stop legal and what doesn't. The officers said they smelled something, but they didn't find anything. No drugs, no weapons, just his work badge and a package he was trying to return." He paused just long enough to breathe. "Smell isn't proof. It's a guess. And since when is a guess enough to throw someone to the ground?" And in that moment, with that one question still hanging in the air like smoke over embers, the entire room stilled, not because of a boy's volume, but because of his clarity. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't. The binder rested open on the table in front of him, pages full of logic, hope, and undeniable pain. His voice faded, but his presence lingered like a note that keeps ringing long after the music has stopped. Jamari took one final breath, closed the binder carefully, and stepped back to his seat beside his grandmother, who reached out and gently took his hand. He didn't need applause. He didn't need a reply. He just needed the room to remember what he said. And they did. When Jamari first opened his mouth to speak in that silent courtroom, he wasn't thinking about being brave or making history. He was thinking about the look on his uncle's face the last time they spoke through a pane of reinforced glass, about how EJ had smiled, even with a swollen lip, and whispered, "Don't let them twist who I am." Those words had followed Jamari through every sleepless night, through every page of legal text, and now, standing in front of a room full of strangers and power, they echoed louder than the judge's gavel ever could. The moment was bigger than him, and yet it belonged entirely to him. His voice was small at first, not weak, but cautious, like someone stepping out onto a frozen lake, unsure how deep the cracks ran beneath the surface. He began with his name, his age, and why he had studied the Fourth Amendment, not because a teacher told him to, but because it was the only way he knew how to fight back, without violence, without fear, without giving them another excuse to ignore what was real. "I'm not a lawyer," he said quietly, "but I know the law is supposed to protect people like my uncle, and I know that what happened wasn't right." The judge, seated tall behind the bench, leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on the edge of the desk, his brow furrowed not with frustration, but with a kind of focused curiosity. The prosecutor stopped shuffling her papers. Even the bailiff, who had seemed ready to cut him off at any second, stayed still. There was a shift in the room, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The kind of shift that happens when truth enters a space and refuses to shrink. Jamari turned the page of his binder, the motion slow and steady, his fingers shaking only slightly now. "They said they smelled marijuana," he continued, his voice gaining shape. "They said that gave them the right to pull him out of the car, to put him in cuffs, to dislocate his shoulder." He paused, then looked directly at the judge. "But there were no drugs, there was no weapon, there was just fear. And fear isn't a reason, it's an excuse." Gasps were stifled. A woman in the second row pressed a hand over her heart. Someone in the back muttered, "Lord, have mercy," under their breath. But Jamari didn't flinch. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to say the thing everyone else was too afraid, or too tired, or too angry to say. He talked about the inconsistencies in the officer's report, the timeline that didn't line up the footage that only began after his uncle was already on the ground. He spoke of how the system allowed assumptions to become facts, how neighborhoods like his were judged before they ever had a chance to be heard. "If the law can be bent for convenience," he said, pausing to breathe, "then what happens when it finally breaks?" At one point, Dolores reached forward to touch his back, not to stop him, but to remind him she was there. He didn't turn, but he felt the strength in her hand, the silent encouragement in her stillness. EJ stared at him now, wide-eyed, a tear caught in the corner of his eye, but never falling, held in place by a mix of pride and disbelief. This wasn't the boy he left at home. This was someone else, someone older, steadier, forged by fire and pressure, and a desperate need to be more than just a bystander to pain. Jamari closed the binder slowly when he was finished. His breathing measured the room, still holding its collective breath. "I'm not saying my uncle's perfect," he said, softer now. "None of us are. But if the law only works for some people, then it's not justice. It's just control." He stepped back, head high, eyes forward, binder still clutched in his hands like a shield, and walked back toward his seat. The floor seemed to creak differently beneath his steps, as if even the building itself recognized the weight of what had just been said. No one spoke for a full 5 seconds. The judge didn't bang his gavel. The prosecutor didn't object. Even the court reporter, who had been typing the entire time, let her fingers rest for just a moment longer than usual. When he sat down, Dolores reached for his hand and squeezed it tight. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. Her eyes were red, but clear, her expression carved with something close to awe. "You did good, baby," she whispered, and Jamari nodded, lips pressed into aligned shoulders, slowly easing down from where they had been held stiff with tension. And just as the courtroom began to breathe again, shifting in seats, coughing softly, whispering low, something else happened. In the very back, a man who had been watching silently from the last row stood and quietly exited, a phone already in hand, his expression unreadable, but his pace deliberate. His name was Anthony Craig, and though Jamari didn't know him yet, that would soon change. But in that moment, Jamari didn't think about what might happen next. He sat still, staring ahead, the words he had spoken still, echoing inside him, not because he'd practiced them, but because they were his, completely, and without apology. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like a kid trying to make sense of a world that refused to make room for him. He felt like someone who had finally stepped into his own name and made it mean something more. And as the light from the high courtroom windows spilled across the polished floor, Jamari's binder rested quietly in his lap, full of laws, facts, and one boy's belief that truth spoken clearly and without fear still had a place in the world. The silence after Jamari sat back down was not empty. It was charged like the air before a storm, heavy with the weight of what had just been said. The courtroom didn't quite know how to react. Some stared straight ahead, their expressions unreadable. Others exchanged quick glances, as if seeking confirmation that they had all heard the same thing. Dolores never took her eyes off her grandson, her hand still wrapped gently around his, as if letting go would break whatever held him together in that moment. And across the room, EJ looked at Jamari with a stunned stillness, the kind that lives in men who've seen too much to believe easily, but who in rare moments allow themselves to feel hope. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingertips steepled in front of his mouth, eyes fixed on the boy who had just disrupted the order of things without raising his voice. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The moment wasn't his. For once it belonged to someone the system had never meant to make space for. Then from the very back of the courtroom a man rose, a tall, composed figure in a gray blazer, his presence quiet but deliberate, as though he'd been waiting for the exact right moment to move. He didn't say a word. He simply walked out his steps, measured his phone already in hand. Jamari noticed him briefly, but his mind was still inside the words he'd just spoken, his heart still thudding like it didn't know whether to slow down or speed up. That man's name was Anthony Craig, a seasoned defense attorney out of Columbus, known in legal circles, not for flash or fame, but for showing up exactly when he was needed and not a second before. He hadn't come to represent anyone that day. He had come to observe, maybe out of curiosity, maybe because someone had called in a favor, but when he heard Jamari speak, something clicked. There was truth in those words that no courtroom could afford to ignore. And when Craig made a decision, he made it quickly. That's how 20 minutes after Jamari sat down the rhythm of the courtroom began to shift again. Craig returned through the side door and spoke quietly to the clerk, who leaned in with raised eyebrows before motioning to the judge. Papers were shuffled. A whisper moved from bench to bench. The judge called a short recess. Most people didn't understand what was happening, but Dolores did. She leaned in close and whispered into Jamari's ear, "You shook something loose in here, baby." He didn't answer, he just looked down at his binder, feeling its weight in his lap like armor. Behind closed doors, Craig introduced himself to EJ, and the court-appointed defense attorney then requested to be added as co-counsel pro bono. He presented the judge with a list of precedents, half of which had been cited word for word by the boy with the binder. He argued that the stop itself was flawed, that the justification based on a smell was not sufficient, that without probable cause, every piece of evidence gathered afterward became contaminated. He referenced the grainy video from the neighbor's window. He quoted Terry versus Ohio. He questioned the officer's language in the report. "They say the suspect resisted," he told the judge calmly, "but what they describe isn't resistance, it's confusion. It's a man trying to understand why he was being treated like a criminal while walking down his own street." The prosecutor pushed back firm but slightly off balance, as if still recovering from the impact of Jamari's testimony. But Craig didn't argue for effect, he argued for the record, and the record once laid out plainly had more holes than it could hold. When the judge returned to the bench and the hearing resumed, the tone in the room was noticeably different. Craig sat beside EJ, his blazer unbuttoned, a yellow legal pad in front of him, eyes steady. Dolores's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her purse strap, her shoulders tight. Jamari kept his hands folded over his binder, watching not as a student but as someone who had just lit the match. Craig rose slowly and addressed the court. His voice was calm, his cadence deliberate, like a man who wasn't in a rush to win but determined to be heard. "Your Honor," he began, "I move to suppress all evidence obtained during the traffic stop on the grounds that the stop lacked lawful justification." He paused, letting the words settle. The officers claimed they smelled marijuana. That was their entire basis for the stop, yet no marijuana was found. No paraphernalia. No illegal substances. No threat. Just a man walking a route he's walked for 17 years. He turned toward the officer seated in the witness box. "Officer, can you describe the smell?" The man blinked. "Excuse me, you said you smelled marijuana. Was it fresh? Burnt? Was it strong, faint, lingering?" The officer shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. "I assumed it was marijuana," he said finally. "That's usually what it is." Craig nodded, then looked at the judge. "Assumption is not probable cause, and assumption cannot be the foundation of a lawful seizure." A long pause followed. No one moved. The judge didn't look up. He was still scribbling notes on a pad, his face unreadable. Then Craig reached into his folder and produced something new footage from a convenience store surveillance camera a block away, showing EJ's slow, calm walk down the street. No erratic movement, no altercation, no indication of criminal activity. Just a man on a familiar route under familiar light, doing the same thing he had done hundreds of times before. The courtroom sat still, as if daring anyone to breathe first. Craig sat down, his hands folded neatly, his case resting not in emotion but in reason. And it was reason finally that began to rise above the noise. Jamari didn't say anything as the hearing closed for the day. He didn't have to. The court now had more than just a child's voice. It had evidence precedent and a man in a gray blazer who knew exactly what to do with both. But for Jamari, the victory wasn't in the technicalities. It was in the shift, the way people looked at his uncle differently now, the way they looked at him. Not as a kid out of place, but as someone who made the whole room pause. As they left the courthouse, the sky had cleared just enough for sunlight to hit the sidewalk in soft gold. Jamari walked beside his grandmother in silence, the binder held close to his chest, not because he was guarding it, but because it had become something more than just notes. It had become proof of truth, of strength, of what one voice, even a small one, could make possible. And as the courthouse doors closed behind them, Jamari looked up at the wide sky, his thoughts quiet but full. The world hadn't changed. Not yet. But something inside it had moved. And he had moved it. The morning of the second hearing began without fanfare. No protesters outside the courthouse, no cameras on sidewalks, just a gray sky hanging low over the city like a lid pressed too tightly onto a boiling pot. The courtroom itself felt quieter than the last time, though it was just as full. Same faces, same bench creaks, same anxious glances passed between strangers and family alike. But the mood had shifted, the tension now tempered by something else: expectation. It was as if everyone in the room could feel that whatever storm had started with a child's voice was still building, gathering strength just beneath the surface. Jamari sat beside his grandmother again, the blue binder resting flat across his lap, both hands pressed lightly on its cover. His fingers didn't fidget this time. His legs didn't swing. He simply stared ahead, breathing slow shoulders, straight eyes, calm, in a way that seemed impossible for someone his age. Dolores didn't speak, but every now and then she'd glance at him, her mouth softening into something that was not quite a smile but full of something far stronger than pride. Across the aisle, EJ sat in a different seat, now still near the front, still flanked by officers but without cuffs, without shackles, his wrists free and resting flat on the table. Anthony Craig sat beside him, flipping calmly through the file in front of him, pausing to underline a sentence here or jot a quiet note there, like a man reviewing a sermon before delivering it. He didn't look up often, but when he did, it was with the steady confidence of someone who had walked into dozens of rooms like this and left each one with the truth a little more exposed. The judge entered a few minutes past 9, his robes swaying gently behind him, his expression the same unreadable calm as before. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his pen against the desk once, then looked across the room with a voice low and clear. "This has been a difficult case." He began, the words deliberate and slow. "Emotions are high. Facts have been contested. But the law must remain the law." He paused, letting the silence settle like a sheet of dust across old furniture, then continued. "The court has reviewed the motion to suppress evidence presented by Mr. Craig. The arguments have been well reasoned, the supporting documentation thorough, and the inconsistencies in the original report troubling." A murmur rippled faintly through the room, quickly quieted by the judge's lifted hand. "There is no clear probable cause established for the initial stop. The body camera footage is incomplete. The supplementary video casts doubt on the stated justification for detainment." Jamari's breath caught in his throat, held there like it was afraid to move too soon. Dolores tightened her grip around his hand, her knuckles pale, her face turned toward the bench like she was willing it to say the one thing they needed to hear. "I am granting the motion to suppress all evidence obtained during the stop," the judge said at last, the words falling heavy and unmistakable. There were no gasps this time, no loud reactions. Just a stillness thick and electric, like the precise moment lightning touches earth but hasn't yet made a sound. Jamari let out his breath slowly, his lungs trembling under the weight of what it meant. It wasn't a not guilty verdict. It wasn't over. But it was something. It was the ground shifting beneath a case built on unstable soil. It was proof that the truth, when spoken plainly and held firmly, could actually move something. The prosecutor rose and requested time to reassess the charges. The judge granted the recess, then nodded to the clerk to begin clearing the session. Just like that, it was done. The official part, at least. EJ stood slowly, turning first to look at his lawyer, then to find his family in the crowd. When he saw them, his mother and his nephew, sitting side by side, still holding hands like they had clung to each other through the entire storm, his eyes flickered, not just with relief, but with something deeper. He stepped away from the table, walked toward them slowly, every step careful, like someone walking across ice that had just started to hold. Dolores rose first, and without a word she wrapped her arms around her son, the way only a mother can, firm, full, and without needing permission. Jamari stood just behind her, his binder still pressed against his chest like it had become part of him. When EJ looked at him, there was nothing but gratitude on his face. Not the kind that comes from being rescued, but the kind that comes from being believed. "You did all this?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. Jamari didn't answer right away. He just nodded, then said, "I just told them what they wouldn't listen to before." EJ pulled him into the hug, wrapping both arms around his nephew with a weight that spoke of everything they had both carried: fear, shame, doubt, and how for a moment it could finally be let go. Around them, people moved, shuffled out of the courtroom, whispered to one another about what had just happened, but none of that reached the space the three of them held. When they finally stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different, cooler, somehow cleaner. The courthouse windows caught the morning light and scattered it across the tiled floor, and for the first time in weeks, Jamari let himself notice how bright it was outside. As they made their way toward the exit, Craig passed them with his briefcase in hand, his stride calm, his expression unreadable. But just as he passed Jamari, he paused, leaned in slightly, and said in a voice only the boy could hear, "You shook the ground under this courthouse, son. Don't forget that." Jamari looked up at him, eyes, steady lips, pressed into a line, not out of pride, but something quieter, something earned. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded, not like a child responding to a compliment, but like a young man accepting responsibility for the truth he had set free. Outside, the sidewalk glistened slightly from the rain that had fallen before dawn, and a breeze carried the scent of something familiar: fresh soil, warm sunlight, and the faintest trace of something beginning again. The street was busy, cars passing, people walking, life moving on as it always did. But for Jamari, everything had changed. And as he stood there, binder still in his arms, surrounded by the people who knew him best, he realized that the moment wasn't just a victory, it was a shift in who he was, and who he would never again pretend not to be. After the courthouse emptied and the news began to slow after the paperwork was filed, and EJ, he returned home to his mother's small but steady house on the edge of the neighborhood. Something quieter settled into place, something harder to explain than relief, but gentler than celebration. It wasn't overjoyed and it wasn't bitter, it was something like exhale after holding your breath for too many days in a row. The world kept moving, of course. Buses still passed on schedule, dogs barked from behind, chain-link fences, and neighbors still waved from porches, though with a little more intention now and perhaps a little more respect. Jamari returned to school that Monday with his usual backpack, same binder tucked inside, though he no longer carried it pressed to his chest. He walked the halls like always, past the same faded lockers, nodded at familiar faces, but something had changed in the way people looked back at him. Some nodded slower, more thoughtfully. Some smiled with a different kind of softness, a recognition of something unspoken. Others stayed silent, maybe unsure of what to say to a boy who had stood up in a courtroom and made grown men shift in their seats without ever raising his voice. His teachers noticed too. They no longer looked at him like the quiet kid who sat near the back, scribbling notes while the rest of the class talked about basketball or music or weekend plans. Now they paused when he raised his hand. They waited for his questions the way people wait for answers. His civics teacher, Mr. Carter, called him into his office that afternoon, not for discipline, not even for praise, just to sit and talk and listen. "You reminded a lot of people," Carter said, leaning forward over his desk, "that justice doesn't always come from the people wearing suits or holding gavels." Jamari nodded, not out of arrogance, but out of a calm understanding that had grown in him slowly, like roots spreading through soil after the storm has passed. Mr. Carter reached into his desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages clean, its cover simple and worn just enough to feel like it had a story waiting to be told. "Keep writing," he said, handing it over. "You've got more to say." Jamari took the notebook with quiet hands, turning it once in his palms before slipping it into his bag. He didn't promise anything. He didn't say thank you right away. He just held the moment for what it was: small, sincere, and real. That night he sat at the same kitchen table where it had all begun, the old blue binder resting beside the new notebook, as if the past and the future had decided to meet right in front of him. Dolores cooked a little more often now. She hummed while stirring her greens, tapped her foot gently while flipping cornbread in the skillet. And though she still worried, still glanced at the news too long, still jumped a little when the phone rang, at odd hours, her eyes didn't hold the same weight they once did. EJ spent most of his time on the porch watching the neighborhood go by, sipping from a chipped mug, speaking little but listening more. One evening, as the sun settled low behind the rooftops and the sky turned the color of faded denim, Jamari stepped outside and sat on the porch steps beside his uncle. EJ didn't look over at first. He just took a slow sip and asked, "You still got that notebook?" Jamari nodded, pulling it from his hoodie pocket and holding it in both hands. "Yeah," he said softly. "Still writing." EJ nodded, eyes on the street voice just above a whisper. "Good. Keep doing it. You make people see different. Not with noise, with clarity." For a while they just sat in silence, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. Crickets chirped from the grass, a lawnmower buzzed 2 blocks away, and someone shouted a name from a screen door in the distance. Jamari looked out at the street, the same street that had once carried his uncle into a police cruiser, now carrying the soft rhythms of an ordinary evening. He thought about everything that had happened, the binder, the speech, the way the courtroom had fallen still when his voice filled it. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel invincible. But he felt steady like a tree that had weathered wind and come through with deeper roots. Later that week, Mr. Carter invited him to speak in front of the civics class, not because of the trial, not even because of what he had said in court, but because he had become someone the other students listened to when he spoke. Jamari stood at the front of the room in his same black sneakers and dark blue hoodie, hands tucked into his pockets until he was ready to talk. The classroom smelled like pencil shavings and chalk dust, the desks scratched with years of initials and declarations of teenage boredom, but none of that mattered. He spoke without a script. He didn't quote laws or cite articles. He just told the truth. "I didn't speak because I wanted attention," he said calmly. "I spoke because silence felt heavier than fear." The room went still. Not dramatically, not reverently, just still, like a shared breath passing from person to person, settling in the corners. He looked at them, his classmates, his peers, the same kids who had once barely noticed he was there, and then added, "We all know something's wrong. Sometimes you just need one person to say it out loud, so nobody feels crazy for feeling it." When he sat down, no one clapped. No one needed to. The moment didn't ask for applause, it asked for reflection. That night, Jamari opened his new notebook for the first time and wrote a single line across the top of the first page. "Not everything that is broken needs to be destroyed. Some things just need to be seen to be rebuilt." Then he closed the cover and sat back in his chair, listening to the sound of the house settling around him, the familiar creak of the pipes, the murmur of the television in the next room, and the soft thud of his uncle's footsteps across the porch, floorboards outside. And in that quiet, he felt something rare and solid, the unmistakable feeling of knowing who you are and being okay with it. In the days that followed, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift. Not just in Jamari's home, not just in the way people looked at him, but in the space inside him, that quiet, private space where uncertainty used to live. He still walked to school like he always did, kicking pebbles off the sidewalk with slow, distracted steps, hands buried deep in the pockets of his hoodie, earbuds silent because music felt too loud now. He passed the same street signs, same parked cars, same front yards, dotted with cracked lawn ornaments and uneven walkways, but everything felt slightly different, like a film had been peeled off the world, and now everything he saw was a little too sharp, a little too exposed. At school, the change wasn't dramatic. It was a series of small glances, quick nods, awkward silences from classmates who weren't quite sure how to speak to him anymore. He heard his name whispered in the halls, not with cruelty, but with curiosity, like he was part of a story still unfolding, and nobody wanted to guess the ending too soon. Teachers paused longer before calling on him, as if weighing their words more carefully, not out of fear but out of a sudden recognition that his silence had never meant disengagement. Even his friends, the ones who used to joke with him in the lunch line or shoot hoops with him after class, now approached with a hesitant sort of respect, like they were trying to figure out who he had become. But Jamari hadn't become someone new. He had simply stopped pretending to be smaller than he was. He still sat at the same desk near the window in Mr. Carter's class, still used the same half-broken mechanical pencil, still doodled in the margins of his notebook when his mind wandered. But now, when the topic turned to law, to systems, to power and its failures, he didn't look down. He spoke, not loudly, not often, but with a clarity that made the room lean forward and stay there. One afternoon, Mr. Carter asked him to stay after class. The room had emptied out, backpacks slung over shoulders, chairs scraping against the floor, laughter trailing off into the hallway. Jamari lingered by the window, watching the trees sway outside their branches, bare and restless in the wind. "Mr. Carter closed the door softly behind the last student and said, "You ever think about teaching?" Jamari turned surprised, a crooked smile playing at the edge of his lips. "Me nah," he said, shaking his head. "I just pay attention." Mr. Carter nodded, crossing his arms and leaning back against his desk. "That's where it starts. Paying attention. Most folks never even get that far." Jamari didn't reply. He just looked down at his notebook, the new one, the leather-bound one he carried now instead of the old blue binder, its pages already filling with more than facts or laws. Now he was writing observations, thoughts, small moments that felt like pieces of a much bigger puzzle. He didn't know what he'd do with all of it yet. He just knew it mattered. That weekend, Dolores brought out a box from the closet, the kind that smelled faintly of cedar and old newsprint, and placed it on the living room floor while Jamari was finishing a reading assignment. "These used to be your grandfather's," she said, quietly opening the lid and revealing a stack of letters, newspaper clippings, and faded notebooks held together with rubber bands. He wrote things down, too, about the strikes, the marches, about what it was like trying to raise a family when the world kept telling him to step aside. Jamari knelt beside her and pulled out one of the notebooks, the paper yellowed and delicate, the handwriting neat and purposeful. He flipped through pages filled with dates, names, memories of meetings held in church basements and old garages. He wasn't loud either, Dolores said, her eyes fixed on the open box. But he never stayed quiet when it counted. Jamari didn't speak. He just kept turning the pages, each line a thread connecting past to present, like the words had waited all this time for someone to find them again. Later that night, Jamari sat at the kitchen table, his own notebook open beside one of his grandfather's. He read for a while, then wrote for a while, then read again, two stories running parallel decades apart but chasing the same truths. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the porch. The radiator clicked softly in the corner, and the house felt full, not with noise but with something deeper. Memory, maybe, or purpose. At one point, EJ stepped in from the porch and leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching his nephew scribble something furiously onto the page. "You writing speeches again?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice. Jamari smirked without looking up. "Nah, just thoughts." EJ nodded, pushing off the frame and walking toward the fridge. "That's where the real speeches start." The kitchen filled with the soft clink of glass bottles, the low hum of the refrigerator door swinging open and shut. Jamari didn't say anything else, but he smiled just a little, knowing EJ was right. And when he finally set his pen down and closed the notebook for the night, he stared at the cover for a few quiet seconds, letting the weight of everything he had written settle into his chest. Not as a burden, but as something earned. Then he stood, stretched, and turned off the lamp, the soft click, echoing into a room filled with stillness, and the faint scent of old paper and fresh ink. And in that quiet glow of a Saturday evening, Jamari realized he no longer needed to wonder if his voice mattered. He had already made the world pause. The morning Jamari returned to court for the final ruling, the sun was just beginning to break through a thin veil of early clouds, casting long, pale streaks across the courthouse steps, and softening the otherwise sharp edges of concrete and glass. There was a hush in the air, not silence, but the kind of quiet that comes when people know something important is about to happen and aren't quite sure how to prepare themselves for it. Inside the courtroom, the benches filled slowly, but there was less shuffling, less whispering than usual, just the slow breathing of bodies trying to stay calm, and eyes fixed on the front like the answer to everything waited behind that tall, wooden bench. Jamari sat between Dolores and EJ, his hands folded carefully in his lap, the familiar leather-bound notebook tucked beneath his thigh like a secret. He didn't look at anyone in particular, but he felt the eyes on him, Not just curiosity anymore, something heavier. Expectation, maybe even belief. EJ, he wore a simple gray button-down, no longer in orange, no longer in chains, his shoulders broad but relaxed, and every now and then he would glance at Jamari with a quiet look that said more than words ever could. It was the look of a man still coming to terms with freedom, still navigating the strange tentative space between anger and gratitude. Dolores, dressed in the same navy blue dress she wore to church every first Sunday, held a tissue in one hand and Jamari's wrist with the other. She didn't squeeze. She didn't speak, but her touch was steady, her presence a grounding force, in a room where everything had once felt unsteady. The judge entered precisely on time, his robe brushing the floor like a curtain being drawn on the final act. He didn't fumble with papers, didn't clear his throat unnecessarily. He looked straight ahead and began to speak in a tone that was neither cold nor emotional. It was measured, respectful, and resolute. The court has reviewed the motion in full and considered all relevant testimony and evidence, he said, his voice echoing gently in the high-ceilinged chamber. It is clear that significant legal questions were raised regarding the nature of the initial stop and the validity of the resulting charges. Jamari's heart was pounding, but his face didn't show it. He didn't move. He just stared straight ahead and listened, every word settling in his chest like pebbles in a jar. The state has elected not to pursue the remaining charges at this time, the judge continued. The defendant is hereby released from all pending criminal proceedings in this matter. The words were clean, simple, almost quiet. But they cracked something open in the room. EJ exhaled so deeply it sounded like a sigh that had been sitting in his lungs for months. Dolores put a hand over her mouth, not crying but somewhere close. A woman in the back whispered, "Thank God," just loud enough for the people near her to nod in reply. Jamari didn't say anything. He didn't smile. He just closed his eyes for a moment, let the words repeat in his mind like a calming drumbeat. Released, no charges, done. The judge offered a final glance toward the defense table, then stood and left without fanfare. The gavel never even came down. It didn't need to. As the courtroom began to empty, people shuffled out in quiet waves, some offering nods or touches to EJ's shoulder, others simply walking past with softened expressions, the kind you give to someone who made it through something you're not sure you would have survived yourself. Craig, the lawyer who had stepped in like a storm and rearranged the case with facts and focus, leaned over and offered a firm handshake. "You walked through fire," he said simply. EJ nodded, his voice caught somewhere between silence and emotion. "He's the reason I made it out." He turned toward Jamari and placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, not in pride but in reverence. "You wrote the map," he said. "All I did was read it aloud." Outside, the courthouse steps felt warmer than they had earlier, the sun now full and certain, casting sharp outlines across the concrete as if tracing every figure in light. Jamari blinked against it and looked up at the wide open sky, then down the street where cars moved like normal again and people strolled past without realizing they were witnessing the end of something sacred. As they stood on the sidewalk, Dolores reached for her grandson's hand and gave it a gentle tug. "You want to go home?" she asked, her voice hoarse but calm. Jamari looked up at her, then at EJ, then back at the building behind them. "Not just yet," he said softly. "I just want to stay right here for a second." So they stood there, 3 generations side by side, framed by history and sunlight and quiet, and for the first time in a long time, none of them needed to speak. They had already said what mattered. The rest could wait. And as Jamari looked down at his notebook tucked under his arm like it always was, he didn't think about the next battle or the next injustice or even the next story he might need to tell. He thought only of this moment where the world had finally listened, and how powerful silence could be when it followed a voice that refused to be ignored. The evening after the final ruling, the house was quiet in a way that didn't feel heavy, it felt earned. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when tension begins to lift, when voices no longer need to strain just to be heard, and when the space between people fills not with silence but with understanding. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops, casting the neighborhood in a soft amber glow, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted in through the open windows, mingling with the familiar warmth of fried onions and something simmering slowly on the stove. Jamari sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had carried his elbows through months of late-night research, frustration, and scribbled notes. But tonight, it carried only the weight of a dinner plate, a glass of sweet tea, and his new leather notebook still unopened beside his fork. Dolores moved calmly between stove and counter, humming something low under her breath, an old tune without words, the kind passed down through kitchens and memories, too old to be traced back to any one person. EJ leaned against the doorframe with a dish towel slung over one shoulder, arms folded, watching the two of them with a quiet that spoke more than anything he could have said. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, collard greens, and cornbread with crisp edges, and they ate without fanfare, without conversation, forced by nerves or pressure, just the sound of utensils against plates, ice clinking in glasses, and the occasional soft millimeters of satisfaction. Halfway through the meal, EJ reached for another slice of cornbread and said casually, "You think you're gonna keep writing, kid?" Jamari looked up, chewing slowly, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I have to," EJ smiled, one side of his mouth curling up, the kind of smile that had seen too much to be wide but enough to be real. "Good," he said. "You've got something worth saying." Dolores glanced over at him and raised an eyebrow. "He's always had something worth saying. He just finally made y'all listen." Jamari chuckled softly, lowering his head a little as if to hide the smile that formed despite himself. "She's not wrong," he muttered. And for a few moments the laughter settled between them, like another member at the table, gentle, familiar, healing. After the dishes were cleared and the kitchen wiped down, Jamari slipped out to the front porch, notebook in hand, and sank into the old wicker chair that creaked under him like it had been waiting. The air outside was cooler now, the breeze brushing against his arms like breath, and the sounds of the neighborhood softened into the distance. Kids riding bikes down the block, a dog barking 2 houses away, someone's television murmuring a familiar tune from behind a cracked screen door. He opened the notebook slowly, let the empty pages stare back at him for a moment, then began to write, not facts, not arguments, not summaries, but something else. "Truth doesn't always knock," he wrote, the pen gliding slowly. "Sometimes it waits for you to step forward and meet it halfway." He paused, listening to the rhythm of the wind through the trees, then continued. "Sometimes you have to be the one who speaks first, so others remember they can speak too." He didn't know what these entries would become. Maybe they'd sit between the pages, read only by him. Maybe they'd find their way into the world. But that didn't matter, not now. What mattered was the act of writing itself, the feeling of shaping what had happened into something he could carry, something he could return to when the weight of everything started pressing in again. After a while, EJ joined him on the porch, bringing 2 cold drinks, and sitting on the steps with a quiet grunt as his knees bent. "That chair's still louder than the rest of us," he said, nodding toward the creaky wicker frame. Jamari smirked. "Guess it's earned the right," he said. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the breeze brushing past their faces, fireflies beginning to blink in the grass just beyond the porch light's reach. "I ever tell you about the first time I almost got arrested?" EJ asked suddenly, his voice low, more memory than story. Jamari looked over, shaking his head. "Number?" EJ took a sip, staring out at nothing in particular. 17 years old. I mouthed off to a cop who told me to get off a sidewalk I'd been walking my whole life. He said I was blocking traffic. He chuckled once, no humor in it. That was the first time I realized rules don't always apply the same way to everybody. Jamari didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The story told itself in the spaces between words. But I didn't have the words back then. Didn't know how to explain what felt wrong. I just carried it. He paused, looked up at the sky, then turned to Jamari. "You didn't carry it. You cracked it open. Made it make sense. Not just for them, for us too." Jamari looked down at his notebook, then at his uncle. "You think it changed anything?" he asked. Not with doubt, but with the cautious curiosity of someone who knows. Change doesn't always come loud or fast. EJ nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do. Maybe not everything, but something. And that's how it starts." The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Jamari leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the stars, starting to pierce through the thinning clouds. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a symbol. He just felt present in his skin in this moment, in this life, that had asked him to grow up a little faster than it should have. And as the crickets began to hum their nighttime song and the world outside slowed into rhythm with the stillness inside him, Jamari pressed his pen to the page again and wrote, "We're not here just to be quiet. We're here to be heard whether they're ready or not. Then he closed the notebook, gently rested it on his lap, and let the silence stretch out around him, steady, honest, and full of everything that needed no explanation. Sometimes after everything quiets down, after the reporters leave the hearings close, the verdicts are sealed, and the House finally exhales, you find yourself staring at the same streets you've always walked, and wondering how they can look so different. That's how it was for Jamari one late afternoon, standing on the cracked sidewalk outside the corner store, where he used to buy grape soda and hot fries with his uncle, long before orange jumpsuits and legal motions changed the shape of their days. The sun was low, bathing everything in a coppery gold, and the heat from the pavement rose in lazy waves that blurred the outline of passing cars. He stood still for a long time, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on the strap of his backpack, watching the neighborhood move, like it always had, but feeling the subtle shift inside himself, the difference between being a kid looking at the world and being a kid the world had seen. People greeted him differently now. Not everyone, but enough that he noticed shopkeepers who used to glance right past him, now nodded with quiet respect. Older folks at the bus stop sometimes smiled like they already knew his name, and even the principal, who used to speak to him like every word needed explaining, now paused to listen whenever Jamari opened his mouth. He hadn't changed how he walked or what he wore or how he carried himself, but something in how others saw him had been rewritten, and he wasn't quite sure how to feel about it. It wasn't about praise. It wasn't about being noticed. It was about weight, the kind that settles on your shoulders when people start expecting more from you than just showing up on time and staying out of trouble. And while part of him wanted to slip back into anonymity, to blend back into the rhythm of quiet hallways and late-night cartoons, another part, a deeper part, knew that silence was no longer an option, not after everything he'd said, not after everything he'd seen. That evening, back at home, Dolores sat by the window peeling apples, her motions slow and practiced, each slice falling into the bowl with a soft thump. EJ was in the living room, flipping channels without watching anything, the sound turned low, more background than focus. The house smelled like cinnamon and something savory on the stove, the kind of smell that made you pause in the hallway just to breathe a little slower. Jamari walked in, set his bag down gently by the door, and stood there for a moment just watching. He didn't say anything at first. He just let the stillness settle around him like a coat he hadn't realized he was wearing. Finally, Dolores glanced over and said, "You all right, baby?" Her voice was soft, not worried, but aware the way only grandmothers can be. "Yeah," he answered after a second. "Just thinking." She nodded, returning her eyes to the apple in her hand. "Thinking's good," she said. "As long as it don't stop you from living." He smiled at that, stepped into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, watching the knife move with quiet precision. "You ever feel like people expect you to be something you're still figuring out how to be?" Dolores didn't answer right away. She finished the apple, set the peel aside, and wiped her hands on her apron before turning to him fully. "Every day I walked into that hospital back in the 60s, she said. "White patients wouldn't look me in the eye. Some nurses called me girl, even after I turned 40. And yet they all expected me to be calm, kind, strong, and never once angry. So yes, baby, I know what that feels like." Jamari nodded, his eyes lowering slightly. "What did you do?" "I kept showing up," she said. "And I kept telling the truth when I could, how I could. And when I couldn't speak it out loud, I made sure I lived like it mattered." There was a silence between them then, but it wasn't heavy. It was something like shared understanding, the kind passed down, without needing too many words. Outside, the porch creaked as the wind shifted, and the last of the sun slipped behind the neighbor's rooftop. Later that night, Jamari sat on the back steps with his notebook in his lap, his pen resting between his fingers, the pages lit by a small lamp from the kitchen window. He didn't write right away. Instead, he listened to the rustle of trees, to the low rumble of a train in the distance, to the faint laughter of kids still playing tag down the street. He let the world speak before he answered. Then slowly he began to write, not about the courtroom, not about the judge, not even about the case. He wrote about his neighborhood. He wrote about the old man who swept his porch every morning, about the boy who always wore mismatched shoes, about the woman who gave out peppermints from her front stoop and called everyone sugar. He wrote about the things no camera caught, the quiet resilience that stitched the blocks together like thread pulled through a quilt. He wrote because someone needed to, because stories like theirs weren't in textbooks and too often got left behind in silence. At the bottom of the page, he wrote a single line in bold, steady letters. "We don't need to be saved, we need to be seen." He closed the notebook, held it in his lap for a moment, then looked up at the night sky, stars faint but visible, like tiny certainties, in a world that didn't always offer them easily. He didn't know where this path would lead, whether he'd become a lawyer, a teacher, a writer, or something he hadn't imagined yet. But he knew this much: his voice wasn't just his anymore, it belonged to something larger, and he would carry it carefully, not as a burden but as a responsibility. Inside, the lights flicked off, one by one. The house quieted, and Jamari stayed on the steps just a little longer, breathing in the air that felt different now, not because the world had changed, but because he had. Sometimes life reminds us that the quietest voices can carry the greatest truth. Jamari wasn't a lawyer, a politician, or someone with power, but he spoke from a place of deep understanding, and that was enough to move an entire courtroom. His courage teaches us something timeless, that wisdom isn't always tied to age and justice isn't always delivered from a bench. It begins in the hearts of those who dare to stand up even when they're scared. For those of us who've seen years come and go, we know the world doesn't always listen the first time. But Jamari showed that when you speak with clarity and compassion, people do listen. So whether you're 13 or 73, your story matters. Your voice matters. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. Speak with kindness, act with purpose, and hold tight to the truth you've lived. Because in the end, it's not about how loud you are, it's about how deeply your words are rooted. And sometimes one quiet voice can shake the ground beneath injustice. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit that subscribe button to stay with us for more stories that matter.